Okay, so we've got this really interesting paper.
Hmm.
It's all about, we've been talking a lot about Gen AI and how it's changing everything.
Yeah, yeah,
And of course, as AI engineers and researchers, you all know that already.
for sure.
But this paper is arguing that we can't just expect our junior team members to become like the Gen AI gurus,
Right.
the ones who are going to be responsible for, bringing all the senior professionals up to speed.
Interesting.
It kind of challenges that pattern that we often see with new technologies.
Yeah, what's fascinating about this is
Yeah.
it really suggests kind of a shift in that dynamic, especially when we're talking about emerging tech like Gen AI.
Right.
So the paper we're looking at today is called Don't Expect Juniors to Teach Senior Professionals to Use Generative AI. Emerging Technology Risks and Novice AI Risk Mitigation Tactics.
Okay. Wow.
Quite a mouthful.
Yeah.
But it's from Harvard Business School and Boston Consulting Group,
Okay.
and they interviewed 78 junior consultants who were experimenting with GPT-4 for business problem solving.
Interesting.
So their insights are really, I think, valuable for all of us thinking about AI adoption within teams.
It does make you think about, all those assumptions that we make, right?
Oh,
Like
that's right.
there's this idea that, the younger generations are digital natives and they're going to be the ones, leading the charge with all the new tech.
Right, exactly. And existing literature really points to this pattern, where senior professionals learn from folks who are kind of closer to the day-to-day tasks.
Uh-huh.
And they even give some examples in the paper.
Yeah.
They talk about radiologists learned about and began using CT scans through interactions with CT scan technicians, and information technology help desk staff learned about queuing systems from junior colleagues who worked more closely with those systems.
So we've seen this play out before with other technologies.
Yeah.
So where does Gen AI fit into all of this?
So that's where it gets,
Yeah.
I think, particularly interesting. So the
Okay.
junior consultants in this study, they did anticipate taking on that role
Right.
of being the Gen AI educators for their managers,
Yeah.
but they also predicted that they would encounter significant pushback.
Oh.
And the pushback that they were anticipating wasn't because of like a perceived status threat or anything like that.
Okay.
It was about the perceived risks associated with Gen AI.
So it's not about senior professionals feeling threatened
Mhm.
by the younger generation's expertise.
Right.
It's a really important distinction.
Yeah, definitely.
So what are those perceived risks that are causing concern?
So they outline 4 key areas that seem to be worrying those senior professionals.
Okay.
The first one is accuracy.
Accuracy. Okay.
And they quote one of the junior consultants who participated,
Mhm.
who said, obviously, the first thing managers will worry about is that leveraging Gen AI can produce output that is actually incorrect.
Mhm.
So that would be a big concern.
Yeah. That's understandable. I mean,
Right.
for those of us working in AI, I think we all
For sure.
kind of share that concern. Because we know that Gen AI, despite, all its amazing capabilities, it's still prone to making mistakes.
Definitely. And relying on inaccurate output could have some pretty significant consequences.
Absolutely.
So the next one that they talk about is explainability.
Okay.
And this is particularly relevant, I think, in the field of AI.
Mm-hmm.
Another consultant in this study said, managers will be worried about GPT because it's a black box and there's no way to check if it is accurate.
Yeah, that black box nature of large language models can make it really hard to trust the output, especially when you can't easily trace, the reasoning behind it.
Exactly. It's that lack of transparency
Right.
that can become a real barrier to adoption, I think.
Absolutely, especially when you're dealing with complex decision-making processes.
Right.
You really need to be able to understand how the AI arrived at a particular conclusion.
Yeah, definitely. So the third risk they highlight is contextualization.
Context.
And one of the consultants really emphasized this. They said, managers will be concerned about the tool being able to take into account all the variables or contexts that are actually necessary to put together a valid solution. It's all about context.
That's so true.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have a technically accurate output,
Yeah. Right.
but if it doesn't consider the specific nuances of the situation, it can be completely useless or even worse, misleading.
Absolutely. And, we talk a lot about the importance of context in AI development, but this really drives it home.
It does, yeah.
An AI system might be really great. Understand the context, where that output will be used. It's not truly intelligent.
Right.
And then the last risk they talk about is complacency.
Okay.
And this is, kind of a human factor more than a technical one.
Right.
As one consultant put it, managers will worry about complacency. They will want to make sure that consultants aren't just blindly accepting GPT output.
Yeah, it's like that set it and forget it mentality, but applied to AI.
Exactly.
We can't just assume that because the AI has generated something, that it's automatically the best or the most appropriate solution.
Right. And all four of these risks, accuracy, explainability, contextualization, and complacency, I think are
Yeah.
particularly, pronounced with these emerging technologies like Gen AI.
Okay.
And the paper goes on to kind of dig into why these are unique challenges
Interesting.
compared to what we've seen with other, technological advancements.
So what sets these emerging tech risks apart? Why is Gen AI different in this way?
So they highlight a couple of key characteristics that I think
Mhm.
make Gen AI kind of a different beast.
Okay.
The first one is the unprecedented accessibility of this technology.
Right.
So unlike, specialized technologies of the past, Gen AI is readily available. It's
Mhm.
customizable even for those without, deep technical expertise.
That's a huge shift.
It is. And they even say in the paper, for example, the adoption of CT scans required radiologists to make significant investments in new specialized equipment, which presented a high barrier to entry and provided radiologists with significant control over its use. However, in contrast to those situations, generative AI tools can be easily accessed, customized, and used even by individuals with limited technical expertise.
Wow. So we're talking about a technology with the potential to impact,
Yeah.
almost every industry and aspect of our lives.
Absolutely. And that leads to the second point.
Okay.
The exponential rate of evolution that we're seeing with Gen AI capabilities.
Right. It seems like every week there's a new breakthrough.
It really does. And they say that generative AI capabilities are evolving at an exceptionally rapid pace.
Yeah, it's a constant learning curve.
Absolutely.
Just when you think you've got a handle on things, boom, there's a new model or a new capability.
Exactly. And the third point is perhaps the most significant one.
Okay.
Gen AI has the potential to outperform humans in many tasks.
Wow.
Not just assist them. This is a fundamental difference, I think, from previous technologies where the focus was primarily on augmentation.
Right.
And they say that in the paper, unlike prior technologies that typically augmented human performance, generative AI has the potential to outperform humans in several tasks.
That's a profound statement.
It is.
It raises so many questions about the future of work, and the role of humans in this increasingly AI-driven world.
And it challenges us to rethink our assumptions about what it means to be an AI engineer or researcher.
Right, because if Gen AI can perform certain tasks better than we can, how do we adapt?
Exactly.
What skills will be most valuable in the future?
These are questions we're going to have to explore further, for sure.
Absolutely. So what's the fourth point that sets Gen AI apart?
The fourth point has to do with the data ecosystems
Okay.
that underpin Gen AI. And they say that the data ecosystems upon which generative AI relies are vast and complex.
It adds to that black box nature,
Yes.
making it even harder to fully understand how these systems arrive at their outputs.
Right. So we've got a technology that's accessible, it's rapidly evolving, it's potentially superhuman, and it's built on these complex, opaque data ecosystems.
Yeah.
It's no wonder there's some hesitancy from senior professionals.
I think that's very understandable.
Absolutely.
And it's in this context, that the junior consultants in the study offered up some of their ideas for how to address these concerns.
Okay.
And this is where we start to see those novice AI risk mitigation tactics kind of emerge.
Okay.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's delve into those novice tactics. What were the junior consultants proposing?
Okay.
And how did their suggestions differ from what the experts recommend?
All right, let's get into it. So the paper categorizes these novice tactics into like three main types.
Yeah, okay.
The first type is kind of highlights this fundamental misunderstanding of Gen AI's capabilities.
Okay.
And it's not meant as a criticism of those junior consultants or anything.
Right.
They're still learning. And Gen AI is so new that
Even for seasoned AI professionals, like us, it's a
Yeah.
constant process of discovery.
it's like trying to navigate a landscape that's constantly shifting.
Exactly.
So what were some specific examples of this misunderstanding in action?
Okay, so let's take the issue of accuracy.
Okay.
Some junior consultants suggested that, you could use standardized prompts,
Okay.
and that would kind of guarantee correct outputs.
Mm-hmm.
But, as experienced AI professionals, you guys know that this oversimplifies the reality
Right.
of working with Gen AI.
Of course, yeah, we know that Gen AI, like any AI system,
Right.
is prone to errors.
It can hallucinate even with well-crafted prompts.
Exactly.
And the paper emphasizes, recognizing these limitations. They say experts highlighted that hallucinations are a known issue with generative AI and recommended approaches to address these issues that focused on careful use case selection and rigorous testing of outputs in different situations. They also argued that such testing should focus on business outcomes rather than simply evaluating whether the outputs were accurate.
So it's not enough to just assume the AI is going to get it right
Right.
every time.
Especially in those complex business scenarios.
Yeah, it's a bit like assuming that someone who can drive a car can automatically pilot an airplane.
That's a great analogy.
The basic principles might be similar,
Mm-hmm.
but the level of complexity and the potential risks are just vastly different.
Totally. Now let's look at explainability.
Go.
Some of the junior consultants suggested that, if you could explain the model's logic
Okay.
to the managers, that this would alleviate some of those concerns.
Yeah.
But again, this approach is oversimplifying the challenge.
I can see how that wouldn't be particularly reassuring.
The inherent opacity of LLMs. They say, while some novice consultants assumed it would be straightforward to explain the logic of the model in order to assure managers of the accuracy of outputs, AI experts argued that the logic of LLMs is often difficult or impossible to trace, even by expert developers.
It's like getting directions from someone who's using a completely different map.
Mm-hmm.
You might eventually reach your destination,
Right.
but you have no idea how you got there or why you took that specific route.
Yeah, and then when it comes to contextualization,
Okay.
some consultants suggested that you should simply avoid situations where deep contextualization was required.
Okay, so just limit Gen AI to very basic tasks.
Right, essentially.
But that significantly underestimates Gen AI's capabilities.
It does, and it's like they were still thinking, within the confines of those older AI systems,
Right.
not fully grasping the potential of Gen AI to handle those complex scenarios. And the paper highlights, how with the right techniques, Gen AI can be incredibly powerful in those contextualized situations.
Okay.
They say, in contrast, AI experts argued that leveraging retrieval-augmented generation, RG, which involves retrieving relevant information from an external knowledge base and providing it to the LLM as part of the prompt, can significantly improve a model's ability to take into account a specific context.
So instead of limiting Gen AI's use cases,
Right?
we should be focusing on equipping it with the tools and the techniques it needs to effectively handle context.
Exactly. That's the expert perspective.
Okay.
So now moving on to that second type of novice tactic,
Right.
we see this focus on changing human behavior
Okay.
rather than system design to mitigate risks.
So instead of focusing on making the AI system itself
Right.
safer and more reliable, they're suggesting ways to train people to use it more cautiously.
Yes. For example, they recommended, training users to validate outputs.
Which on the surface sounds reasonable,
Yeah,
but it places a heavy burden on the human operator.
it does.
And as we all know, humans are fallible,
Very much so.
especially when we're under pressure or dealing with, a lot of complex information.
Exactly. And the paper highlights those limitations of relying solely on human oversight. They say, experts emphasize the need for such systems to include mechanisms for monitoring the performance of the model, identifying potential issues, and alerting users to potential problems or biases in outputs.
So it's much more effective to design systems with, built-in safeguards.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
automatic monitoring or source linking, or even having, a second AI system to double-check the outputs.
Absolutely.
It's like having a safety net built into the system itself,
Yeah.
rather than just telling people not to fall.
I like that analogy. And this same principle applies to addressing complacency.
Yep.
So some junior consultants suggested emphasizing user ownership, making people feel ultimately responsible for the AI's output.
Okay.
While this might sound effective,
Mm-hmm.
the experts recommend a different approach, designing systems that encourage critical thinking and active engagement.
So instead of just telling people to be more careful, you're building those checks and balances into the system itself.
Exactly. And they say, experts recommended designing systems with features that encourage users to reflect upon and critically evaluate the output, such as self-reflection prompts, designed to encourage users to consider alternative perspectives or to identify potential limitations or biases in the output.
So features like self-reflection prompts
Yeah.
or uncertainty visualizations that kind of nudge users to stay engaged and question the results.
Exactly. And for contextualization,
Okay.
the junior consultants were focused on things like training people in prompt engineering,
Right.
or simply avoiding those contexts that required deep contextualization.
Which puts the onus on the human.
It does.
But the experts suggest a more system-focused approach.
Yes, they do. They recommend designing systems with features that make it easier for users to provide information about the relevant context to the model, such as prompts that explicitly ask users to specify relevant information about the context, central prompt libraries of prompts tailored to specific business tasks, or systems that prompt the user about their goals and preferences at the beginning of an interaction.
So they're basically saying that instead of trying to change human behavior, we should focus on designing AI systems that are inherently safer, more reliable, and better equipped to handle, the complexities of real-world situations.
Exactly. It's a much more robust and sustainable approach to risk mitigation.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so we've covered 2 types of novice tactics.
Yeah.
What's the third one? Okay, so we've talked about those novice tactics
Yeah.
that stem from, misunderstanding Gen AI's capabilities,
Mhm.
and those that focus on changing human behavior.
Right.
So what about that third category?
Okay, so the third type is a little more subtle, I think, but it has some pretty significant implications. It's the tendency to focus on project-level solutions rather than like company-wide
Right.
or even ecosystem-level approaches to addressing these Gen AI risks.
So instead of looking at the bigger picture,
Right.
the focus is on how to manage it sort of on a case-by-case basis.
Exactly. And so, for instance, they suggested things like project-specific agreements on Gen AI usage,
Right.
or having managers closely monitor, Gen AI use within their teams,
Okay.
which aren't bad ideas in themselves,
Right.
but they lack that broader perspective.
I see what you mean. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a systemic issue.
Exactly.
You might address the immediate problem,
Right.
but you're not really solving the underlying cause.
And the experts in the paper really advocate for a much more, expansive approach.
Mm-hmm.
They say system deployers, for example, could provide co-audit tools that enable managers to review how generative AI is being used and to identify potential problems or biases in outputs. Alternatively, system deployers could provide clear guidelines regarding appropriate use cases for generative AI, particularly in high-stakes contexts, such as generating code for safety-critical systems or providing medical advice.
So it's about creating those tools and guidelines that
Yeah.
apply across the entire organization, not just to individual projects.
Exactly. We need to move beyond these isolated solutions.
Right.
And really think about, how do we integrate Gen AI responsibly and ethically into the very fabric of our organization?
This is really making me rethink, how we approach Gen AI adoption and training within our own team.
Yeah.
It's not just about teaching people how to use the tools. It's about creating a culture of responsible AI development.
Absolutely. And, it goes beyond just individual companies.
Right, yeah.
We need to think about, the entire ecosystem that's involved in, developing and deploying Gen AI.
Right.
The paper says it is important to consider not only how generative AI is used, but also who is involved in developing, training, and deploying these systems. Model developers, for example, have a responsibility to ensure that the data used to train these models is high quality and that they have taken steps to mitigate potential biases in the data.
So we've got to consider that entire life cycle of Gen AI,
Yeah.
from its development to its deployment and use, to make sure that, those responsible practices are embedded at every stage.
Exactly. It's about fostering that collective sense of responsibility, I think, within the AI community.
Yeah, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation.
I agree.
It's clear that, we need to move beyond the hype and the technical aspects of Gen AI
For sure.
and really grapple with those, ethical and societal implications of this technology.
Couldn't agree more. And this paper provides a really valuable framework, I think, for thinking about those implications, especially in the context of, team dynamics and organizational structures.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? Those AI engineers and researchers out there who are, grappling with Gen AI adoption within their own teams.
So I think first and foremost, be proactive.
Okay.
Don't wait for those junior team members to come to you with solutions.
Right.
Educate yourself about the risks, stay up to date on the latest research and the best practices, and really, actively participate in shaping how Gen AI is used within your organization.
Lead by example.
Yeah.
Show your team that you're committed to responsible AI development and that you're willing to, learn and adapt alongside them.
Absolutely. And don't shy away from those, tough conversations about the ethical implications
Yeah.
of Gen AI.
Right.
Encourage your team to think critically about, the potential impact of their work, not just the technical challenges.
This paper has given us a lot to consider. But I think one thing is clear. Gen AI is incredibly powerful,
For sure.
but it's not a magic bullet.
Right.
It requires careful consideration, thoughtful implementation, and that ongoing dialogue to ensure its responsible and effective use.
Well said. And as this technology continues to evolve, I think that responsibility is only going to become more critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to leave our listeners with a final thought,
Okay.
we've talked a lot about, the risks and the challenges,
Mm-hmm.
but let's not forget about Gen AI's incredible potential, to
Yeah.
solve real-world problems and drive positive change.
The possibilities are mind-boggling.
They are.
But we need to approach this technology, I think, with a sense of wonder,
Yeah.
but also a healthy dose of skepticism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to be the ones asking the tough questions,
Mm-hmm.
setting the standards,
Mm-hmm.
and ensuring that Gen AI is used for good.
Yeah,
That's our challenge as AI professionals.
it is.
And I think it's a challenge that we're ready to meet.
I agree. It's been a pleasure diving deep into this topic with you.
Likewise, and to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Gen AI,
Yeah.
always with a focus on responsible development and deployment.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.